Okay, let's go ahead and get started. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Naomi Paik, and I'm so pleased to welcome you to this afternoon's event featuring Alex Vitale. I'd like to start with our land acknowledgement. So we recognize and acknowledge that we are on the lands of the Peoria, Kaskaskia, Piankashaw, Wea, Miami, Mascoutin, Odawa, Sook, Miskaki, Kickapoo, Potawatomi, Ojibwe, and Chickasaw nations. These lands were the traditional territory of these Native nations prior to their forced removal. These lands continue to carry the stories of these nations and their struggles for survival and identity. As a land-grant institution, the University of Illinois has a particular responsibility to acknowledge the peoples of these lands, as well as the histories of dispossession that have allowed for the growth of this institution for the past 150 plus years. We are also obligated to reflect on and actively address these histories and the role that this university has played in shaping them. This acknowledgement and the centering of Native peoples is a start as we move forward. So as we gather to experience this event on the failures of police reform and what we can do to actually build communal safety, we have an opportunity to reflect on the ways that systems of oppression have shaped this institution in particular. We challenge all of us to create new relationships and systems that support reciprocity, dignity, and the liberation for all people. And just as a sidebar, I want to shout out our students who have been organizing to adopt the kingfisher as UIUC's official mascot and to replace the chief at long last as we enter this third decade of the 21st century. It is long past time. And I also want to commend the students for producing their own kingfisher merch and bringing to life their ethical demand without waiting for the institution. So way to go. Thank you so much. Okay, so before we get going, let me explain how this Zoom format works. Please do ask questions at any time through the lecture today through the Q&A function, which you can find at the bottom right of your Zoom window. You won't be able to access the chat. We've actually disabled it for the purposes of this meeting, but we encourage you to post comments and questions in the Q&A. And while we welcome all kinds of questions, including critical ones, we do not welcome abusive language or threats of violence. You can also, if you need it, you can access the closed captioning in the bottom right corner of the Zoom window with the CC live transcript button. So I thank the co-sponsors of this event, the College of Law Program in Criminal Law and Procedure, the Education Justice Project, the Center for Advanced Studies Initiative on Abolition, and the HRI Mellon Initiative in the Legal Humanities. And my very deep, deep thanks go to Holly Klingen, Cindy Smith, and the other workers whose invisible labor makes this event possible. The main sponsor of this event is the Public Safety, Policing, and the Justice System Working Group, a task force that seeks to address racism at UIUC. Obviously, given the regular police murders of citizens like 7th grader Adam Toledo, among the 3 people per day who've been killed by police during the Chauvin trial, and the clear targeting of Black community members by the UIPD as seen in Lee Gaines' reporting, addressing police violence must be central to any effort to dismantle racism here. At this moment, it's not entirely clear how the recommendations of this task force, which includes 4 police officers, will be implemented. And as Dr. Dylan Rodriguez has argued, such task forces often allow universities to preserve and protect the violent institution of policing. And yet I cling to the hope that the UIUC administration will prove this statement wrong, even as I witness its truth unfold. I am thus profoundly grateful that Alex Vitale is here joining us today to discuss the end of policing, why police reform won't make us safer, and what will. And I hope Dr. Vitale will guide the task force and the rest of us on what reforms are a waste of time and our resources, and where those resources are better spent. So now let me introduce our speaker. Alex Vitale is professor of sociology and coordinator of the Policing and Social Justice Project at Brooklyn College and a visiting professor at London South Bank University. He has spent the last 30 years writing about policing and consults both police departments and human rights organizations internationally, This is his fourth talk today, by the way. Okay. Professor Vitale is the author of City of Disorder, How the Quality of Life Campaign Transformed New York Politics, as well as The End of Policing, which is a fantastic book. Everyone should read it. His academic writings on policing have appeared in Policing and Society, Police Practice and Research, Mobilization, and Contemporary Sociology. He is also a frequent essayist whose writings have been published in the New York Times, Washington Post, The Guardian, The Nation, Vice News, Fortune, and USA Today. He has also appeared on CNN, MSNBC, CNBC, NPR, PBS, Democracy Now!, and The Daily Show with Trevor Noah. So everyone, please join me in welcoming Alex Vitale.
Thank you, Naomi. It is such a pleasure to be back at the University of Illinois. Last time I was able to visit in person, which was really great for me. Both my parents are from Illinois, from the southern part of the state. The Vitales were coal miners in the area around Carbondale. And I spent many vacations at summer and winter time in Southern Illinois and experienced the profound transformations that part of the state were undergoing at that time and continue to maintain some connection to that part of the state. So hopefully we'll get another chance to meet again in person before too much longer. I want to talk a little bit, as Naomi laid out, about the limits of police reform and some ways to think about how to move forward. So after the police killings of Mike Brown and Eric Garner and Tamir Rice and Sandra Bland and so many others in this period about 6 years ago, we were told, don't worry, we're going to fix policing. We're going to implement a whole set of reforms. The Obama administration created a task force on 21st century policing that released a whole raft of police reforms. And many communities have implemented some or all of these recommendations. Here in New York, we implemented implicit bias training, de-escalation training. We outfitted police officers with body cameras. The officers involved in the killing of George Floyd, not just Chauvin, but the other officers who were involved that day, had implicit bias training, mindfulness training, de-escalation training. We're wearing body cameras. We're operating under a new use of force policy that emphasized sanctity of life. We're operating under a new policy that required that officers intervene if they witness misconduct by a fellow officer, especially if it threatens the sanctity of life. And we're operating under an early warning system to identify potentially problematic officers. And none of it made any difference. George Floyd's life did not matter to them. And yet, whenever policing experiences a crisis of legitimacy, like the moment we're in right now, we're told yet again that policing can be reformed. And we see the same kinds of reforms trotted out. Most of these reforms we can think of as involving what we call procedural justice orientations. This is the idea that if we make police more professional, less biased, better articulated with the legal system, that this will produce a more legitimate form of policing that will win the community back to the good graces of policing, and the police can get on to doing what they're doing. Well, let's take a minute to look at what some of these reforms are about and why they are not going to fix this problem. One of the most popular and widely implemented is implicit bias training. This continues to be talked about across the country and increasingly internationally. It's included in the federal Justice for George Floyd bill that recently passed the House of Representatives, that has been kind of held up as the model of federal intervention in terms of police reform. And it doesn't work. Now, first of all, it assumes that the problems of racially disparate policing, arrests, use of force, discourtesy, are rooted in unconscious individual level bias. Unconscious individual level bias. And this is based on research that shows that yes, people do have unconscious biases that we can measure through complex laboratory tests, et cetera. But this is not really relevant to the deeper problems of racially disparate policing. First of all, we have a problem of explicit racism in American policing. When we look for it, we find it on the Facebook pages, the chat boards. The official statements of some police union leaders are openly racist. Here in New York, they just fired a deputy inspector, a very high-ranking police official, who for years had been using a pseudonym to post racially inflammatory rhetoric on a police-only chat board. And what was his job at the NYPD? He was in charge of the Equal Employment Opportunity Office. He's who you went to if you felt like your boss was sexually harassing you or engaged in racially discriminatory behavior. And for years, he had been posting racist screeds using a pseudonym on a chat board. No amount of implicit bias training is going to fix that. No amount of lecturing that officer about the history of slavery and the role of policing in reproducing racial inequality is going to fix that. And this is a huge problem. The FBI has numerous investigations of white supremacists actively organizing within the police. At the same time, it is also a mistake to think that the problems of racially disparate policing are the result of racist police officers. Increasingly, actually, the diversity of policing mirrors the diversity of the United States. It's not actually that disparate. And in the big cities, a majority of officers now are non-white. In New York and Los Angeles and in Washington, D.C., and Baltimore and Detroit, and I believe in Houston now, majority officers are not white, and much of the leadership in places like Philadelphia and other major cities, the leadership is largely non-white as well. And it doesn't make sense to say that those officers are engaged in, racist policing and that that's what motivates their behavior day in and day out. Instead, we need to understand that there's a problem of structural racism at two different levels. The first level is at the level of the police institution itself. The reality is that policing has always been a tool for producing racial inequality, whether it's in its origins in the American South, in the production of slavery and the maintenance of slavery, or out west, where policing was primarily a colonial project designed to drive out and exterminate indigenous populations, to drive out historical Mexican and Spanish landholders to make way for white settlement, whether it's the use of police to facilitate convict leasing, the maintenance of Jim Crow, the creation of urban ghettos, the war on drugs. These have all been very clear racial projects that policing have been the central tool for managing. And then to imagine that now, with a couple of hours of racial sensitivity training, we're going to overcome 200 years of structural legacy is naive. It's that simple. It's naive and it's also disingenuous. But there's an even bigger problem. And this is the decision by elected officials to turn the problems of poor, mostly non-white communities over to police to solve. To conceptualize the problems of those communities as problems of crime to be managed by violence workers. Because that's what police are. That's what distinguishes police from all other types of government workers, is the authority and ability and authorization to use violence. And this is the problem. Well, let me step back for a second. So police will say, look, the racially disparate outcomes of policing are because we go where the crime is. We go where the 911 calls are. But of course, how we frame what counts as crime matters here. The systematic poisoning of the water supply of an entire town is not considered a police problem. It's a regulatory matter. The predatory lending practices of multinational banks is considered a securities and exchange problem, a banking regulation problem. It's not a policing problem. And yet these are profound harms. The financial value of wage theft by employers is dramatically more than the value of all property crime that has been turned over to police to manage. So not all harms are treated in the same way. The harms of poor and dispossessed and vulnerable communities are defined as crime problems to be suppressed by violence workers. And this places an extra burden on those communities. The everyday burden of intensive and invasive policing, the burden of fines and court judgments, the burdens of incarceration, of being constantly put through the criminal justice system, and the burden of police violence. 7% of all homicides in the United States are committed by police officers. In some communities, it's double that. In some communities, it's as much as 20% of all homicides. So the police are, in fact, a producer of violence in our communities in many cases. And this is the problem I have with community policing. Whenever policing experiences a crisis of legitimacy, Rodney King, Amadou Diallo, Mike Brown, George Floyd, we hear community policing trotted out as the solution. But community policing is rooted in the idea that the community is supposed to bring its problems to the police so that the police can develop a solution. But what tools do police have to resolve our community problems? Guns, handcuffs, ticket books, tear gas. These are not the tools that are going to solve our community problems. Do they have access to stable, affordable housing, high quality mental health services, medicalized drug treatment, counselors for our young people in schools who are struggling? No, they don't have any of the tools that safe or affluent communities rely on to produce public safety for their members. So what we've done is we've systematically defunded the social safety net and social services for communities, and then turned the problems that result into crime to be suppressed through intensive and invasive policing. And this is the fundamental analysis that's driving the current movement to defund the police. It is not a movement that imagines, well, if tomorrow we could just disappear all police, then our work here is done. The point here is to try to produce public safety in a way that is better than the system we have now, that doesn't come with all the collateral consequences of using violence workers to solve our community problems. So what are we using police for? It turns out primarily to manage the consequences of systems of inequality. So policing emerges in the 19th century in relationship to the three primary systems of economic inequality and exploitation during that period, which are slavery, colonialism, and the production of a stable, compliant industrial working class. Now, today, we don't have slavery and colonialism in that 19th century sense. And in the US, we barely have industrialization. What we have instead is neoliberal austerity. This is the idea that in the face of globalization, which these elected officials created through their discourse around free markets, in the face of that, all government can do in local places is to subsidize the already most successful economic actors in hopes that they will become so successful on the global stage that some of that wealth will trickle down to the rest of us. And so local governments give tax breaks to the rich, deregulate, give them incentives, do their downtown development deals in hopes that this will create some broad economic prosperity. And to pay for the tax breaks and the deals and the incentives, they've had to cut back, austerity, defund schools, defund social programs, defund municipal workers. But the result has not been broad prosperity. The result has been the creation of a class of billionaires that didn't used to exist, that have the majority of the country's wealth. And at the other end, we've produced mass homelessness, mass untreated mental health and substance abuse problems, failed schools, mass involvement of in black markets of drugs and sex work and stolen goods because people don't have access to formal employment or any kind of social safety net. And then we've turned each of those problems into a crime problem to be managed through policing. Managed, not solved, managed. Because police, no matter how many homeless people they arrest, don't do anything to reduce the amount of homelessness. The police, no matter how many mental health crisis calls they go on, don't do anything to connect people to actual, stable, ongoing mental health services. Police, no matter how many children they arrest in school, don't fix the schools. They just manage the problem so that elected officials can continue to do their downtown real estate deals and their tax breaks, right? And so that these social problems don't get so out of hand that they interfere with their redevelopment strategies, their tourism-centered economy, or whatever it is they are pursuing. And this produces this bipartisan consensus that we have that says that every social problem under the sun is something for the police to manage because it serves a political function for these elected officials. So what should we do differently? Well, we should demand that the state, that government at all levels, quit using its resources to make inequality worse and then paper over the problem with intensive and invasive policing. Instead, we should look at the kinds of social problems we have, take immediate steps to ameliorate those problems through interventions rooted in care, compassion, and solidarity rather than coercion and violence, while we work on making bigger structural transformations. We need to get police out of the mental health business. Between 1.25% of all people killed by police in the United States are having a mental health crisis because we've systematically defunded our mental health infrastructure and then turned the problem over to police. We need to create high quality, community-based mental health services, non-police crisis intervention teams to actually deal with people as human beings, not as criminal legal subjects to be neutralized. Cities are doing this. Denver recently released the results of the first 6 months of their new STAR program that replaces police on mental health crisis calls. They did not request police assistance in a single incident. They're diverting a significant number of 911 calls and they're saving the city of Denver millions of dollars. The CAHOOTS model in Oregon has been around for a number of years. They have much more robust data, tens of thousands of calls. Police are asked to assist them in less than 1% of all calls. They handle now 20% of all 911 calls, and they're saving Oregon about $10 million a year in this small area of Eugene and Springfield and some surrounding communities. And that doesn't include the savings of emergency rooms and jail time. That's just in direct costs of policing. This can be done. We could get police out of the schools and off college campuses. We could actually look at what's driving harmful behavior by young people and develop strategies to address it. We have millions of kids that go to school with school police and no counselors of any kind, no school nurses, no assistance of any kind for these young people when they're in crisis, except an armed police officer. This is perverse. This is perverse. It is the criminalization of a whole generation of young people. And even for those young people who are not a source of problem, who don't come to the attention of school police, they are going to school in an environment where they are told their fellow students are a threat, and the way we deal with threats is through the criminal legal system. This is inculcating a deeply conservative Manichaean worldview that I think is harmful to democracy. We need to get police out of the drug business. We've had this war on drugs for over 40 years in its modern form. No lives have been saved. No one has been prevented from getting drugs. Anyone in the United States can get any kind of drugs anytime they want them. That's because the war on drugs was never about public health or public safety. It was a rancid politics of racial dog whistling. It was part of a strategy by the Republicans to convince white Southern voters who had historically been in the Democratic Party to switch to the Republican Party after Johnson and the Democratic Congress votes for civil rights legislation and dismantles formal segregation. And Nixon says, hey, guess what? Republicans are going to be the new home of racism. The Democrats sold you out, and the way we're going to do that is through the war on drugs. How do we know this? Because people on Nixon's staff have come forward over the years who were in the meetings who said this had nothing to do with public health, public safety, it had nothing to do with drugs. It was about racism. And we need only look at the implications, where the overwhelming majority of people in prison in the United States for drugs are Black and brown. There are no buy and bust operations happening on Wall Street, even though we know drugs are everywhere on Wall Street, because it's not about that. If we were serious about improving public health and safety, we would get the police out of the drug business and turn it over to public health authorities. That's what Portugal has done. They got rid of the narcotics units, they decriminalized all drugs, and the public health indicators are better. Voters in Oregon recently voted to do the same thing, to decriminalize drugs and turn it over to public health authorities, and to get police out of the drug business. We need to do that for sex work. We need to do that in relationship to homelessness. And we need to dramatically shrink the scope and intensity of policing and demand that government provide real solutions to our problems, that they provide people with basic medical care, basic housing, high quality education. This is what makes communities safe, secure places, not having an armed police officer on every street corner. I know that the University of Illinois is involved in its own internal conversation about what to do about campus policing. And once again, we hear the same kinds of reforms being trotted out. Well, we'll try to better professionalize the officers, give them some sensitivity training, perhaps. We're going to expand the scope of policing by giving mental health counselors to the police department. Well, this is exactly the wrong way to go. The university needs to instead ask itself why it has turned problems over to police to manage. The history of campus policing is actually rooted in the politics of suppressing student activism, not in questions of public safety for students, faculty, and staff. The vast majority of professional, uniformed armed police forces is in the wake of the liberation struggles of the 60s and 70s to more efficiently and effectively suppress student activism. And then a patina of public safety is added to this. But my sense is that what the University of Illinois police are doing primarily is policing the community outside the university. They're not managing the problems of the university itself. One of the things we know about crime, so-called crime on college campuses, is that it is an internal problem. It involves members of the college community engaged in property theft, property destruction, and sometimes intimate partner violence, sexual assaults, date rapes, things like that. Policing is not particularly effective at addressing a lot of that. And you can just look at the numbers. They don't catch a lot of people. And when they do, it doesn't really address the problem. We need to engage in broader cultural changes that address the misogyny that drives a lot of harmful behavior on college campuses. We need to look at the economic security that some of our fellow students experience. At my own campus at Brooklyn College, we have students who are homeless. We had to create a food bank on campus to address the profound economic insecurity of some of our students. And this was even before COVID. Policing can't fix those problems. Let's figure out what's really driving problematic behavior and develop real strategies to address that, instead of imagining this fantasy world in which police are hiding behind every bush to catch the bad guys who are preying upon us. This is not what police do. This is the fantasy of television. And we need to implement public safety initiatives that aren't rooted in punishment and violence. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alex. That was so great. And I really appreciate the clarity of your analysis and all of the kind of receipts that you're bringing. That moving things out of policing into other more appropriate agencies, it benefits everyone, even people who aren't necessarily targeted by police in the way that many disenfranchised communities who are subjected to organized abandonment would be. Okay, so we have a number of questions that have come up into our chat. So I'm just going to go ahead and give you some of these questions. So Candace Livingston asks, as we imagine and work towards a society without policing, prisons, and surveillance, how can we transform the Police Training Institute while policing is in the process of being abolished? So I'm not sure if you know this, but UIUC has its own police training institute, and it very much has this it leans into the narrative that we don't do warrior training, we do the kinder, gentler police training. So how can we transform the Police Training Institute at UIUC into a space to promote transformative justice and equity?
Well, I'd like to see some evidence that this training works, because my reading of the literature is that there is no such evidence, that this is all smoke and mirrors. This is trying to imagine that policing is something that it isn't. It's trying to imagine that we can just turn police into social workers and community organizers by training them to be more sensitive, to more attuned to community concerns. But that's not the nature of that institution. Police are violence workers, and that is the basic mission. Not that they've created for themselves, it's the mission that's been given to them. Elected officials have decided that a whole set of social problems are now to be managed by police, but they don't give police the tools to actually solve those problems: housing, medical care, social services, and all the rest. So this creates a dynamic that, in my view, inevitably leads to violence, discourtesy, and racially disparate outcomes. It's unavoidable. So imagine, right, the case of Eric Garner. So here's a person who had tons of involvement with the criminal legal system, had been arrested dozens of times. It had no deterrent effect, did not solve his problems, was hugely expensive, and led to his death. Why? Not because the officers woke up that day and said, let's go get some black guy and kill him. I don't believe that for a second. I've never thought that. No, these are professional police officers who set out to engage in mundane, everyday law enforcement, which was someone's complained about someone causing a public nuisance, whether it was selling loose cigarettes or just hanging out there. Really, that was the problem. He was hanging out there in an area that was slated for redevelopment. New buildings had been put in, and they didn't like seeing him out there. And so they did what they had done dozens of times before. They were like, you're under arrest. whether you did something this moment or not, we know you do bad things, so you're coming with us. And he said, no, this is not legitimate. Your constant harassment of me is not legitimate. It's racialized oppression. So he refused to comply. And at that moment, all the non-warrior training, all the sensitivity goes right out the window. And he is managed through violence. And they will use whatever violence is necessary to control that situation. Did they mean to kill him in that moment? I don't think so. I never thought so. They would be very happy if he had survived that. But there was also no world in which they turn around and say, okay, let's talk about this some more tomorrow. No, they're going to control and dominate that situation. And learning different holds and mindsets, it's all irrelevant in that moment. And that's the problem. Let's quit sending the police to manage the George Floyds and the Eric Garners.
I actually want to kind of lean into this point. I'm seeing, my phone is blowing up. It appears that Chauvin has been convicted on all charges for the murder.
It can't be all charges. They're mutually exclusive, so they got to pick one. So
okay, it looks guilty on. Well, I'm seeing some. Okay. It does say it's all three, or anyway, he has been charged guilty, or he's been,
okay.
Yeah. So I wanted to talk a little bit about this because there are so many differing opinions on what something like this would mean. As someone who watched Laquan McDonald's murderer go to jail, and yet that has done nothing to change the behavior of the Chicago Police Department that regularly murders Black and brown people all the time. And so I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about what does jailing and convicting a killer cop, what does that do for all of the kind of transformations that you're calling for that are necessary to get out of this kind of cycle of reform, relegitimacy, and the ongoing police violence? So can you say a little bit more about what this, what is the meaning of the Chauvin conviction in this moment? And does it actually move us towards the goals that you're talking about, or something else?
Probably not. Probably not. So, we're in this really no-win situation here, where we've created a system where everyone understands that justice equals vengeance, that accountability is measured in years of incarceration. So now the question is going to be, well, how long is the sentence? Is it long enough? Right? So we got the conviction, but is it 10 years? Is it 20 years? Is it 30 years? Is there any number of years that will bring justice? No. And is there any number of years that will fix policing? No. So these convictions are incredibly rare. And when they do occur, the narrative that we hear is the system works. This was a bad apple who went too far. We dealt with him, and now we can go back to doing what we're doing. And in fact, the whole idea of the conviction is another example of legitimacy seeking, right? The police in Minneapolis made a conscious decision to let him go. And you could see this because they all came and testified against him. Usually they close ranks and they try to subvert the prosecution, but legitimacy could not be maintained in this case if they did that. So it was necessary to convict him. But there's no necessary reason to think that this will lead to any transformation of policing. First of all, it's a mistake to think that we can fix policing by trying to reverse engineer a solution based on these very high-profile, horrific incidents. It's anecdotal. We come up with solutions that seem logically to fit, but actually have no evidence behind them. But also, the harms of policing are not limited to these high-profile incidents. A totally lawful, procedurally proper, unbiased, low-level drug arrest is still going to ruin some young person's life for no good reason. There's no justice in it. The previous 12 or 14 arrests of Eric Garner brought no justice to anyone, even if they didn't kill him, even if they didn't injure him, right? So policing is producing harms and injustice even when they don't kill people. And so whether we get rid of qualified immunity, have more convictions of police officers, this is not going to transform policing in my view.
Thank you for that. It's so hard because when in the absence of any other kinds of state justice other than punitive justice, and if you are a community that is literally starving, you'll actually eat some poison because it's at least it's something.
Absolutely.
And yet it doesn't advance like any of the goals that we actually want.
Absolutely. And we should not be in the business of like criticizing people for wanting that. We just have to say, look, this is not going to be enough. We have to talk about what real justice might look like. You know, when you talk to victims and families of victims of serious crime, and you have real conversations with them over time, what they want is for this not to happen to anyone else.
Exactly.
And throwing 1 or 2 killer cops in jail is not going to accomplish that.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. I want to, there's so many questions and all of them are excellent questions. I hope we can get to most of them. I want to circle back to this issue of the kind of kinder, gentler police, right? I think that, you know, even the Chauvin trial shows that cops know that they're in the midst of a legitimacy crisis and they're willing to make that kind of sacrifice in order to shore up the authenticity or the legitimacy of the force overall. And so Angela Ting asks, how can individuals and groups who are dedicated to defunding and abolishing the police take steps to resist the discourse around kinder, gentler policing that UIUC police and administration like to parrot?
Well, I think we have to ask some questions about what is the function of this massive police apparatus that the university is spending huge millions of dollars on. Like, really, what is it accomplishing for us? And is this the only possible way to accomplish it? And to continue to point out, right, that policing is inherently dangerous. It's dangerous to democracy. It's dangerous to the well-being of individuals who are policed. It's dangerous to the well-being of communities that are over-policed. So if policing comes with all these potentially harmful collateral consequences, shouldn't we do everything we can to find solutions that aren't rooted in policing, that don't come with these consequences, rather than pretending that we can turn them into officer friendly? And I'll just say, like, something related to this and the previous thing, right? When our elected officials tell the police to wage a war on drugs, a war on crime, a war on gangs, a war on terrorism, a war on, you know, illegal aliens and all, it's not going to be friendly. It's not going to be courteous. It's not, you know, this is a fantasy of television that this is possible. It's a fantasy of people who are not policed, right? It's very easy to sit in a nice, wealthy suburb that is basically has no police. They write some traffic tickets, right? They take some reports, and to say that therefore, because policing works for me and is not of such a big deal, that's what we're going to give you, when policing is experienced in an entirely different way in other communities.
Yeah. We have some kind of related questions to this kinder, gentler, reformist kind of position. So Nachiketa Adhikari asks, what about co-responder models, right? Where a cop shows up with a social worker or a counselor to a mental health crisis call. Isn't that better for a mental health crisis than just cops showing up? And he adds, I ask because UIPD is proposing that these cops show up to mental health crisis calls in plain clothes, i.e. not in their uniforms. And is there any evidence showing that the lack of a uniform leads to less violence? Guadalupe Araiza also asks, can you say more about why UIPD's efforts to hire diversity coordinators and more people of color into its ranks won't solve the problem of police violence?
Okay, so co-responders. The evidence is not good here. This is being done in a bunch of places. Now, there are a few places that show some small improvements in outcomes by doing a co-response. But when you look carefully at the results, it turns out that that is only true in those places that have simultaneously increased community-based mental health services so that the co-response teams have a bunch of new resources available to them. Which begs the question, let's just increase community-based mental health services. The other question that is begging to be asked here is, what value does sending an armed police officer add to these interactions? And my reading of the research is none, that in fact, it's on net a negative, that it's destabilizing. And that's why you get these proposals to send a non-uniformed officer, because they know that sending a uniformed officer is actually destabilizing, is a negative in these interactions. So they're trying to figure out how to get out of this without giving up any police power. And this just, why send an armed police officer? When we create non-police crisis response teams, they work perfectly well with no police. So let's just do that. Oh, and diversity, I'm sorry, diversity. So my friend Jennifer Kobina and I, who's at Michigan State in the CRIM program there, we wrote a piece recently for the Crime Reporter about the fact that, you know, increasing diversity of officers is not going to fix this problem. She wrote a book about Baltimore and Ferguson that's quite good, that talked with residents about their experience of diversified policing, and they're like, this is not fixing the problem for us. The research shows that, you know, for a small number of very large departments, they found some statistical benefits if they reached a certain very high threshold of minority, so-called minority officers, even though they're really the majority. So, you know, maybe we can have, and also female officers have been shown to use slightly less force, although the effects are small. And does that mean if we had all female officers, all violence would go away? Certainly not. But this is all tinkering at the margins. The effects are very small. And if we don't change the scope and intensity of policing, change the fundamental mission of policing, dramatically scale it back, I don't think we're going to get the kinds of results that people are looking for.
This question kind of follows up by kind of moving backwards. Tariq Khan asks, can you talk more about what the history of modern policing institutions, as developing from slave patrols, strike breakers, frontier ethnic cleansers, etc., tell us about the function of the police and the debate of abolition versus reform? So how does its structural roots, its historical roots in all of these, you know, systems of racist social control, how does that inform the debate over abolition versus reform?
It turns out I wrote a book on that subject called The End of Police. Yeah. So I can't possibly, you know, rehash the whole argument here. I tried to allude to it. And there's a shorter version about this in the new inquiry called like The Myth of Liberal Policing or something that I wrote. That's a little snapshot, so you can read some about that history there. But let me just say that there's this liberal myth that policing is created to enforce the rule of law in a way that benefits everyone and creates a stable, liberal, democratic society. And people point to the London Metropolitan Police as like the first police force and a great example of this. But this is an obscuring of the real history, that policing does not emerge out of the desire for liberal democracy. It emerges out of the need to produce more legitimate forms of social control to manage regimes of profound exploitation. So even the London Metropolitan Police are A, not the first police force, and B, are modeled on the English occupation of Ireland. Sir Robert Peel, who creates the London Police, Bob, the Bobbies, his job before creating the London Metropolitan Police is that he's in charge of the English occupation of Ireland, a colonial project. And he creates the Irish Peace Preservation Force as a tool for more efficiently and legitimately managing agricultural uprisings in the Irish countryside. And then he takes that to London to manage the influx of rural workers who've been displaced by the enclosures movement that's privatizing public lands and creating widespread homelessness, poverty, hunger in the English countryside. People are flooding into London to try to find work in the new industrial economy, and policing is used to manage that. Policing in the US is based on these same dynamics, and I would argue the first police force in the world that meets the definition of a modern police force is the Charleston City Watch and Guard, created in the late 1700s, well before the London Metropolitan Police of 1829. But the reason no one talks about them in the liberal discourse is that their primary job was managing mobile slaves who worked outside the homes of their owners. And that doesn't square with this liberal democratic myth of policing, so they just ignore it. And therefore, once we have this historical analysis, this helps to prevent us from making the mistake that we can fix policing with implicit bias training.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. Yeah, so I, again, will encourage everyone to get Alex's book, The End of Policing, which you can get on Bookshop or anywhere else except for Amazon. Okay, so there's so many questions. Okay, there's a lot of questions around this, what is to be done, but before we get to that, I want to ask some more specific questions. So Austin Hoffman asks questions about the Fraternal Order of Police and cop unions. Okay, so how do we deal with the fact that police unions like the Fraternal Order of Police, who represent campus police at UIUC and the city of Urbana, we tried to ask for to at least know when the negotiations were gonna happen with the UIPD, and we were refused that information. How do we deal with the fact that police unions often use their power to obstruct legislation or reforms that would limit the scope, power, and resources of the police at the local and municipal level? Some of the problems with policing could be addressed at the contract level, but these negotiations are not transparent or open to the public, even though police are so-called public servants. So I think this gets to this question, and I'd love to hear you think out loud about this, or just tell us what you've already done so much about, especially around this question of accountability and transparency versus like abolition, like let's just move the resources out.
So on the one hand, right, if the police, according to liberal democracy, are supposed to represent the interests of the community, why is it that we're not allowed to know anything about what they do? We can't see the contracts. We can't see time studies. We can't see their deployment patterns. We can't see the collective bargaining process. If it's all supposedly done to protect us and in our interests, why do they feel the need to obscure all the information? And this is true across the board with policing. I mean, it's better in Europe, but in the US, it's just immediately, you can't know anything about what we do because we are our own political entity. Now, does that mean that if we just knew what was in the budget and the contract, that then we would automatically be able to fix things? No, but I think it would make it easier for us to point out the ridiculousness of these budgets to the public if people knew what the money was actually going to. And anyone who has looked closely at a municipal budget is for defunding the police, because the expenditures are just wildly out of proportion with anyone's idea of what would be good for a city. And partly this is the result of police power, which is exercised in part through these police unions and associations. But it's important to keep in mind that these things are not powerful only in and of themselves. They're a locus for a whole set of very conservative politics. And we need to look at things like who's on the police foundation board or who the big police boosters are to see, oh, certain kinds of corporate interests, conservative homeowners associations, real estate developers, right? These are the folks who are invested in a police-centered approach to problems. And this is in part because of this neoliberal austerity model, which says, oh, the problems of these communities or crime, which is the result of moral failure that can only be dealt with through repressive policing, because the alternative would be to acknowledge that these are problems of market failures. Failures of labor markets, housing markets, government services, healthcare markets. And the police boosters, the last thing they want is for the government to intervene in markets, which is where they extract resources through those market systems. They don't want more justice in those systems. So they need everything to be defined as a policeable problem that's rooted in moral failure, which is often thinly veiled racism.
Yeah, and I think you kind of did a 2-for-1, because Jasmine Tejada asked the question, like, why won't why do government officials continue to reform the police when they know that these other solutions actually work much better? And I think you already answered her question. So
Yeah,
I
it's
really
cheaper and it
that.
serves a larger ideological function.
Yes, yes, absolutely. I want to focus a little bit. So there's a kind of a batch of questions that are focused more on like schools and universities, and then there's some broader questions. I'm going to focus on the school specific ones first, and then I want to kind of pan out a little bit and then go to the what is to be done question. Okay, so this actually relates to our discussion earlier today with the community members. So Peggy Patton asks, can you speak to the belief held by some parents, teachers, and even students that the presence of school resource officers, aka cops in schools, create safer schools? Do you know the number of instances when serious fights broke in schools, even with the presence of SROs? The Stoneman Douglas School in Parkland, Florida is one example. Is this typical?
Okay, so there is research about the effectiveness of school policing, and it's quite damning. It does not produce safer schools. It does not reduce crime. Crime rates actually go up, but that's probably just because things that were considered a discipline problem are now being labeled crime. But and when we survey students, they don't feel safer. Now, there's a little bit of a problem here, right? Which is that we have eviscerated everything else good about the school in many cases, or other systems for managing problems. And then we have this massive system of school policing. And so people feel like, oh, well, there are problems, and then the school police come, so at least something is happening. And when they hear criticism of school policing, they imagine, oh, wait a second. We've had one tool to deal with all these problems, school policing, and now they want to take that one tool away. Won't that lead to chaos? Well, it might, if that's what anyone was talking about. But of course, that's not what anyone is talking about. The whole point of this movement is to create more public safety with less collateral consequences. And we have plenty of strategies for doing that. Here in New York City, we have 5,000 NYPD personnel attached to New York City schools. That's more than all counselors of all varieties combined. That's just a perversion of any kind of notion of how to produce well-being for our children. So we got to reverse those priorities. We've got to focus on how to produce well-being for kids, how to make a successful learning environment. And we don't do that with police. We do that with counselors, more teachers' aides, better extracurricular activities, mentors, restorative justice programs. But if we're going to be successful in turning this ship, we have to communicate that to parents and students. The choice is not police or nothing. The choice is police and all these other amazing things we could have to enrich the lives of our students.
Yes. So yes, I agree completely, which is why I brought you here. Anyway, okay. So thank you so much for that, because the struggle to remove SROs from schools is an ongoing one. It was not successful this round, but that contract is constantly being renewed. So we know how long the runway is, and we know what we need to do in order to mobilize the base to get these cops out of schools. Okay.
You know, I just recommend looking at the Black Organizing Project in Oakland, which spent years organizing with students and their families. And, you know, won a big victory, canceling the school policing in Oakland and putting in a whole set of alternative strategies. So this can be done. It is happening. And so we just got to keep fighting.
Yes. And a lot of folks here at UIUC are also working against policing on our own campus, especially because it reinforces the divide between the campus and the community, which none of us think is a good structure, right? So there's a couple of questions. I think I'm going to batch them so that you can kind of think about them together. So Angela Ting asks, here in Champaign-Urbana, there are 3 police forces that have overlapping jurisdictions over the community: the Champaign PD, the Urbana PD, the UIPD, and I would also add the County Sheriff's Office. Can you speak about why unclear lines of jurisdiction might be potentially problematic? I will also note here that the UIPD, their jurisdiction is state property. So that means their jurisdiction is basically the entire state. We touched every county in the state. And Angela also asks, do you have any suggestions or resources to help guide students living in university housing for not calling the police to handle issues? And then finally, I'm going to add one more question. If you need a reminder, just let me know. Candace Livingston asks, what are concrete steps that administrators and trustees at UIUC can take right now to reduce the university's reliance on policing?
Well, maybe I'll try to take them in reverse order. Well, they could quit deploying the police outside the university, which speaks a little bit to the overlapping jurisdictions problem as well. They can quit imagining, that the community is this threat that's looming outside the gates when most of the problems on campuses are from people within the campus. And this speaks to the second issue, is what can we do within the community to produce more safety for people? We need to look at the transformative justice movement, which is a source of great practice, not ideas in the abstract, but actual practice. There's a great book, Beyond Survival, that is a collection of writings from people engaged in these practices. And there's also Mariam Kaba's new book, We Do This Till We Get Free. Am I saying it right? Close.
We do this till we free us. It's an incredible book. Everyone should.
It's actually, I think, sitting behind the computer here at my desk it's just come out, so I'm still working through it. Okay, so we need to think about best practices. Are there harmful behaviors in the dorms? Yes, of course. So, but what can we do to create informal systems of social control rather than formal systems of social control? Because it turns out, for one thing, informal systems work better. So this is about creating a kind of culture about what's appropriate, with the understanding that there's going to be some harm and there's going to be some risky behavior and there's not going to be perfection. Policing certainly doesn't eliminate any of that. And we're not going to invent some perfect system that makes everything completely risk-free. But we want to reduce the harm. So we need to figure out, well, what are these harmful behaviors? Binge drinking, date rapes, online bullying, whatever it is, right? And begin to actually address these as problems. Bring it out into the open. Talk about this. Create systems of community accountability among students themselves. Empower, women's organizations to call people out, to create processes for addressing these things that don't immediately transfer to the criminal legal system or to getting a student expelled, right? What can we do? Because students make mistakes. Sometimes they're quite harmful, but even then, the goal of a university is to help people develop, not to X out the few that we don't like, right? So what are we doing to try to fix this, involving the criminal legal system being this absolute last resort kind of option? So take a look at some of those best practices. On the first one about overlapping jurisdictions, I mean, there are concerns here about different standards of use of force, different missions that have been given. We see cases where one department is like, we don't do that, and the other department does. We see also venue shopping. Well, the state system won't prosecute this vigorously enough, so we get a federal agency involved because we know they'll do something more vigorous. The university should not have anything to do with these task forces, partnerships, fusion centers. These things are all deeply harmful and problematic, and the university should have nothing to do with them.
Yeah, it's strange here because we like our campus is literally split down the middle between two different cities, and then the campus cops have jurisdiction on what is campus, but you could move like from one side of the street to the other and be in a different jurisdiction. So our students and campus community members are basically triply policed at all times. I will also say, in terms of your reference to transformative justice or sort of justice models, that it is the very institutes and units that you're talking about as alternatives, like the Women's Resource Center and like other units under the Office of Inclusion and Intercultural Relations, that have been consistently defunded. From the moment I got here, at least, which is, I don't know, 7 years ago, I've never seen like a massive budget increase. In fact, I've seen it kind of being shrunken and withered away. So the very alternatives are being gutted, even as we keep investing into police. Okay, just also for people still on the call, we are going to be hosting Transformative Justice in the Universities event on May 3rd as part of our kickoff for Abolition May. So you can email me if you want more information. Unfortunately, we don't have the chat, so I can't drop the link to you. You also had mentioned that without these other alternatives, it is unlikely that students are going to report on a friend or another student if they think it will lead to that friend's arrest or kind of ensnarement by the police. So we really do need these alternatives. Okay, so thinking more along these lines in terms of—
I'm sorry, let me just talk.
Oh yeah, go ahead, please.
Talk about this for a second, right? So imagine a student has been subjected to a sexual assault, whether it's from within the community of the university, or maybe even a partner that's not part of the university community, or a stranger. The first intervention should be someone who's concerned about their well-being, not enacting some kind of punishment. Someone who first is going to take care of them medically, emotionally, and then is in a position to help guide them through next steps. Because invoking the criminal legal system comes with costs for the victim, especially in these kinds of cases. So where if our real concern was the well-being of students, we would have a huge infrastructure available for folks who've experienced some kind of harm or crisis to think about what's in their best interests. Once you notify a police officer, you lose control of the situation. It's now the state versus, right? They don't really care what you think anymore. And they may further victimize you through the process. So we need to create a system where someone can go safely to a women's resource center, a health clinic, a rape crisis center, where it's victim-centered, not police-centered. But what we've done is we've systematically defunded these alternative possibilities that actually help women, and turn the whole thing over to a policing apparatus, which is more concerned with enacting vengeance and more concerned with reducing liability for the university.
I think that's such an important point, that the main role of the university when they get involved in these sexual assault cases is to protect the institution, not necessarily to protect the student. I also want to emphasize it's not just women who are survivors of sexual assault. And also women are primarily the victims of sexual assault, but there are certainly men and gender nonconforming and trans people who are absolutely victimized by sexual assault. So I just wanted to add that little footnote. There's a batch of questions that are like, okay, where do we start, kind of? Rebecca Marie asks, given the extensive research on interventions that prevent violence, like mental health and general wellness support, community building, access to basic resources, do you agree that a logical and effective strategy for campus safety would significantly increase funding for these sources? Relatedly, Colleen Ramayas asks, do we need to change state and federal law to decriminalize drugs, happy 420, and remove them from the purview of law enforcement? Can we do it on a more local level? And then finally, Alexandra Harmon Threat asks, what should be the priorities? There's so many things that need to be done, right? So what should we prioritize for funding to make the biggest impacts on improving equity for Black and Brown people? Is it housing, after school programs, social work programs? Like, where do we begin?
Okay, well, the answer to the first one is easy, yes. The second one as well. I'm sorry, tell me the second one again. It went.
Do we need to decriminalize drugs?
Yeah, okay, yeah. So yeah, I didn't realize that it was April 20th in that double meaning. So thanks for reminding us all. Yes, obviously we need to decriminalize all drugs, create some kind of legalization regimes as well to make sure that people are getting stuff that's not adulterated and dangerous for them. All of these are public health interventions. We have research behind the things that work, and we just need to do it and quit thinking that if we wag our finger and threaten people with jail time, that this will reduce people's drug behavior, harmful drug usage behavior. And the third one, again, was more, that's very expansive. What do we do right now? So as I think some of you know, I had a nice meeting with the task force. I'm sorry, it's not called a task force. It was a working group, I think. You have to do a local needs assessment. So I don't know what the exact dynamics are on that campus. So we got to you need to figure out what are the harms out there that students and other members of the community need to be, let's say, protected from, or that need to be addressed in some way. And then let's figure out what strategies could most effectively and humanely and cost efficiently do that. And so, I mean, it turns out that university campuses are very safe. So there's a lot of exaggeration of threat that's not realistic, but there are threats, but they're mostly about things that police are extremely ineffective in dealing with, like date rape and online bullying and harassment and things like that. So we need completely different strategies to deal with those things. And so you've got to assess the situation. I can't give you some cookie cutter general plan and then just plop it down on each campus, because these campuses are different and I just don't know enough about the local context.
Thank you so much. I will also say that in terms of Illinois' decriminalization of cannabis, obviously that is a step in the right direction. And also the vast majority of dispensaries that sell cannabis are owned by these large conglomerate companies, mostly run by wealthy white people, and that even though there was supposed to be racial equity built into the distribution of cannabis, that has definitely not happened, and people of color are being boxed out of this lucrative new industry, even though we had one of the most progressive laws. So it's also about, all kinds of things in Illinois, corruption, things like this, but racial justice has to be central to decriminalization.
But they at least didn't make the mistake that Colorado made, right? Which is to create a dynamic where only purchases through the state regulated stores is allowed. And so there's still a lot of criminalization of marijuana dealing in the communities. So that we do obviously need to address those racial justice issues, and New York's law attempts to do this a little bit more robustly. So we're in a period of experimentation and adjustment right now.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to ask, kind of pan back a little bit and then move forward. I'm going to ask, we have 15 minutes. I'm going to ask you 3 more questions individually. So James Kilgore, who you know, asked, how is technology impacting policing? And is there a technological solution to the issues you are raising?
Oh, I would have expected such a question from James. Yes. Okay, so there is, Americans love a technological fix. They want to engineer their way out of the environmental crisis, homelessness, everything, but it's not so simple. What we're seeing is that police are using technology to merely legitimate already racialized and practices that fall disproportionately on already vulnerable communities, et cetera. The work that my Policing and Justice, Social Justice Center does in New York is mostly around gang policing. And we see the proliferation of gang databases, predictive policing algorithms, enhanced surveillance technology. And all this is doing is just driving more young men of color into the prison system. It's not producing more justice. It's not creating safe, healthy communities. And it's more money for police departments and the contractors that they work for. And there's an excellent piece in the Guardian newspaper today about tasers and how tasers are not saving any lives. They're expanding police violence. And it's mostly about a lot of corrupt business practices.
Thank you for that. When I looked into gang databases a little bit for a project that I was working in. I found evidence that even babies, newborn babies, were listed as gang members because one of their parents was also listed on the gang database. But I think one of the troubling things about the technological innovations around policing is that we don't see them. We don't understand, at least I don't understand exactly how they operate. And so I feel like we need a lot more research into this area, like by James and the network that he's got going on and things like this. Okay, so Allison Salisbury. Allison, I really want to just say that I appreciate your question so much because you are absolutely not the only person to be thinking this or asking this to themselves. And so she asks, I'm struggling to phrase this, but I'm wondering what can we envision for people who are in policing roles once their jobs are obsolete and phased out, i.e. if there are no longer officers throughout the criminal justice system, which careers should they pursue?
Great. So my view on this is mostly, we're not going to just like eliminate all policing tomorrow and a bunch of people are looking for jobs. This is going to happen over time through attrition, et cetera. But those jobs won't exist anymore. So I was in Houston before COVID, and I did an event, and some police came, Black and brown police officers from Houston, and they said, look, we wanted to, lift ourselves up. We came from badly policed neighborhoods. We thought we could fix policing from the inside. It didn't work. We were hoping you could tell us how to change the culture of policing. And I said, there's no changing the culture of policing. I asked them a question instead. I said, look, when you were thinking of being a police officer, if you had had a choice between two jobs with the same pay and benefits, one as a police officer and one working in a community center in your own neighborhood, coaching football and mentoring young people, which job would you have preferred to have? And they all laughed. This is Texas football. They were like, we would love to have had a job like that. But there were no jobs like that. And I said, exactly. There are never jobs like that. There is no such job like that. Not that pays the same as a police officer. And that's the problem. We need to create those jobs instead of creating police jobs. And mental health counselors and substance abuse treatment specialists and school counselors and all kinds of things. It would be instead of investing in criminal justice college programs, we need to expand justice studies, social work, clinical therapies, all these other interventions instead.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, I think this actually leads quite nicely into Stephanie Posey's question. And this is something that I struggle with a lot because what I don't want to see is that like we just replace police with some other kind of role without doing all of that structural transformational change. So Stephanie Posey asked, thank you so much for a great talk. How do you suppose we intervene with policing logics in general? For instance, there are social workers, teachers, counselors, even organizers who believe in police and policing and provide services from a punitive point of view. And so I think, this is a question that I've been thinking about a lot. I would love to hear what you say.
Yeah, this is very important and very difficult because we have turned everything into a carceral logic, right? Into a punishment-based system, into a discourse about personal responsibility and moral failure. And so we don't want to just transform policing into a racist, oppressive welfare system that uses cash benefits to manipulate people and produce racially disparate outcomes. So this is where we need to look to the transformative justice movement, I think, which says that to the extent that we possibly can, we need to organize ourselves independently of the state, that we need to try to mobilize community resources, community knowledge and wisdom to try to solve our problems without invoking the criminal legal system or these other state bureaucracies. And we need to work to transform society, to overcome the legacies of slavery, colonialism, industrialization, neoliberal austerity, and all the rest. But we're not going to make those bigger transformations until we kill that cop logic. Because that cop logic, as I was explaining before, that thin blue line mentality, is not just a justification for policing, right? It's an argument that says that all of our problems are rooted in moral failure and will only respond to violence, threats, coercion, and all the rest. So by creating models of positive social change rooted in a logic of care and compassion, even if they don't transform all of society overnight, we're undermining that logic of the carceral, of policing, of the thin blue line. And that creates more space for us to address housing justice, employment justice, medical justice, and all the rest.
No, I agree completely. And I think Paula Ximena Rojas says we need to abolish the cop in our heads, right? And that we have been so kind of, we're products of this society in many ways. And so a lot of us have adopted a kind of cop mentality, even internally, even if we're abolitionists, like sometimes, I kind of want part of me wants Breonna Taylor to find punitive justice, you know what I mean? And it's something that I have to struggle against and to really think about, well, is that actually advancing the goal that I want to see societally, transformationally? But it is very, very difficult. And I think this is something that we all have to work on collectively with each other, and then also like looking inside of ourselves as well. So I think we have time for one more question, and I want to highlight Serene Amra, who's one of our undergraduate students. And she asked an excellent question. Okay, across the country, communities are using their imaginations to create new practices and institutions to displace policing. So which of these might be the most productive for UIUC to implement instead of funding a police force? So I think there's a question about how do we get the cop out of our head and use our imaginations to create something else? What can that something else?
I think, look, let's just start with the most concrete thing. They want to expand the police budget by folding mental health services into the policing apparatus. This is the exact opposite of what we were talking about. So at the very least, maybe we could stop that from happening and say, if there's money to hire more people to provide mental health services, great, we'll take it. But why on earth would we put it in the police department?
Yeah, absolutely. I so wish that the chancellors were attending this webinar to hear your answer, because they are ultimately the ones who are approving the hires and working with HR and kind of promoting very aggressively promoting this program as being a step in the right direction. But what you've been saying over and over and over again is that this is exactly the wrong thing that we need to be doing, and that we need to be thinking more creatively, more imaginatively. So Serene, I think that we collectively need to use all of our imaginations and come up with something different, not only to block what's happening, but to actually, in the community meeting, Alex, you said, we need to think about what is our positive vision for what we actually want. We know that we want to dismantle all of these harmful systems, but we also want to create something that is based on care and compassion, right? So I think we'll leave it there. And I am so deeply grateful to you. For those of you who don't know, Alex has spent his entire afternoon zooming into different meetings in Champaign County. And so I'm so deeply grateful to you for all of your time and all of the work that you've been doing and for all of the kind of knowledge that you're sharing with us. It's incredibly generous, and I'm so deeply grateful. To everyone who's still on the call, I know that we got a lot of comments earlier on about people. It's a very intense time right now, especially with the Chauvin verdict. And so I just want to say that I'm here with you. I'm sending you so much love. I want you to take care of yourself, be with your community, take care of yourself, take a break. You know, if you need to not watch the news, don't watch the news, but please be loving and kind to yourself. And we are sending you so much love as well. Thank you so much.